Imagine soaring 70,000 feet above hostile territory, confident that no enemy weapon can reach you. Francis Gary Powers, a pilot for the CIA, had that confidence on May 1st, 1960, as he piloted a U-2 spy plane over the Soviet Union until a sudden thump and flash of orange light proved him wrong. In an instant, the aircraft lurched out of control, struck by a Soviet surface-to-air missile. Powers desperately tried to stabilize the nose-diving plane, but within moments, he had to eject as it spiraled down over Soviet soil. The ensuing international fallout from this shoot-down would push superpower tensions to a new peak. By 1960, the United States and Soviet Union were locked in a high-stakes chess game, each anxious about the other's nuclear capabilities. President Dwight Eisenhower proposed an open skies plan in 1955, but Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev flatly refused. This plan proposed mutual aerial surveillance between the United States and Soviet Union to reduce surprise nuclear attack risks through transparency and verification. Lacking such transparency, the American government turned to secret high-altitude aerial reconnaissance, an area where there was a significant technological edge over the Soviets. The Lockheed U-2 spy plane was developed to fly at altitudes around 70,000 feet, so high that officials believed it would pass over the Soviet Union undetected. They also believed that it was beyond the reach of Soviet fighters or missiles. While they were right about the former, the latter would be proven very wrong. Starting in 1956, U-2 overflights gathered valuable photographs of Soviet bases and missile sites. The Soviets did track these flights on radar and even fired on one U-2 in 1959, but Khrushchev kept quiet about these incidents. After all, he didn't yet have any hard proof that these were American planes. Despite his misgivings, Eisenhower allowed U-2 missions to continue for vital intelligence. In April 1960, with a summit looming, he authorized one last deep penetration flight to gather updated intelligence on Soviet nuclear sites. The mission would launch from Pakistan, fly across the breadth of the Soviet Union to photograph key missile sites, and then land in Norway. In the early hours of May 1st, 1960, Powers took off from Peshawar, Pakistan, in a U-2 loaded with cameras. The Soviets weren't caught by surprise. Anticipating an intruder plane, Soviet air defense units were on high alert along the U-2's planned route. As the U-2 slipped into Soviet airspace, fighter jets tried in vain to intercept the high-flying aircraft. When they weren't successful, ground crews then launched a salvo of surface-to-air missiles near Sverdlovsk in the Ural Mountains. At least one missile exploded close enough to blast apart the fragile spy plane. Powers bailed out from the stricken U-2, struggling at first with his oxygen hose but ultimately parachuting to the ground alive. He carried a poison needle hidden in a silver dollar to avoid capture, but he never used it. Powers was promptly seized by Soviet authorities, and wreckage of his U-2 was recovered for all the world to see. The Soviet authorities proudly exhibited the recovered pieces of Powers' aircraft in Moscow, parading the mangled aircraft parts to prove the American espionage. But I'm getting ahead of myself here, since the way the Soviets broke this news to the world was done to maximize the humiliation to Eisenhower. Back in Washington, news that a U-2 had gone missing over the Soviet Union caused a panic. American officials assumed Powers was likely dead, and the plane completely destroyed, so they hastily concocted a cover story. On May 5th, NASA released a press statement claiming a quote-unquote weather research aircraft had, quote, gone missing north of Turkey. And I guess the Soviet Union technically was north of Turkey, and I guess there were probably some weather instruments on the plane. To bolster this lie, the United States even showed off a U-2 painted with fake NASA markings, pretending it was a harmless high-altitude weather plane. Meanwhile, Khrushchev made a shrewd move. He announced on May 5th that an American spy plane had been shot down deep inside Soviet territory. Khrushchev was a masterful political operator, though, and he didn't put all his cards on the table. He omitted the fact that Powers had survived. Believing their ruse was working, American officials stuck to their fabricated tale for several more days, digging a deeper hole. Khrushchev sprang his trap on May 7th. With obvious relish, he revealed to the Supreme Soviet that the captured pilot Powers was alive and well. Not only that, Soviet recovery teams had retrieved the U-2's sophisticated camera equipment for air-to-ground surveillance. This was truly cutting-edge technology, which at the time wasn't publicly acknowledged to even exist. The American weather plane story instantly collapsed in perhaps the most humiliating way possible, and the Soviets weren't going to be modest about what just occurred. Khrushchev mocked the Eisenhower administration's attempted deception, noting that he had deliberately let them tell on themselves with ridiculous cover-up statements. Embarrassed on the world stage, the United States had no choice but to admit that Powers had indeed been on an espionage mission. Eisenhower publicly accepted responsibility, acknowledging the spy flights as necessary for national security in the nuclear age. However, he pointedly refused to apologize to the Soviets for conducting the aerial surveillance. This seemingly small detail would help cause a frosting over of American-Soviet relations that became even more pronounced in the decade to come. Khrushchev's personal relationship with Eisenhower had been improving in the late 1950s, and both sides hoped the upcoming Paris summit on May 16, 1960, would be fruitful. In the days before the conference, hardliners in the Kremlin pressed Khrushchev to respond aggressively to the U-2 provocation. When the summit opened in Paris, the Soviet leader launched into a furious tirade against the U.S. and President Eisenhower, then dramatically stormed out of the meeting. The summit collapsed on day one, with no discussions on arms control or anything else achieved. Eisenhower was left bitterly disappointed, considering it one of the worst debacles of his presidency. Had the incident not occurred, Eisenhower lamented, the talks and even a planned goodwill visit of his to Moscow might have significantly improved East-West relations. The Soviets put Francis Gary Powers on trial in Moscow, staging it as a propaganda spectacle. In August 1960, just months after his capture, Powers pleaded guilty to espionage in a Soviet court and was sentenced to 10 years of confinement. The trial, held in a grand hall and heavily publicized, showcased exhibits of the U-2's wreckage and surveillance photos as evidence of American aggression. Powers, however, wouldn't serve the full sentence. After enduring roughly 21 months in Soviet custody, he was exchanged in a prisoner swap on February 10, 1962. Although Powers returned home to public criticism for not destroying his plane or making the ultimate sacrifice, he was cleared of wrongdoing. That said, this didn't stop the speculation at the time. One persistent theory held that Powers deliberately allowed his U-2 to be shot down in an attempt to defect to the Soviet Union. Under this theory, he allowed his plane to fly lower than it ought to, putting it in range of Soviet missiles. Advocates pointed to the mission's deep penetration route, Powers' failure to trigger the aircraft's self-destruct, and his decision not to use the poison needle. Soviet propagandists amplified these claims, portraying him as a willing turncoat disillusioned with American policy. Yet declassified records and later investigations undermine the idea. Powers had no secure means to guarantee capture alive, no prearranged Soviet contacts, and no realistic expectation of humane treatment. All evidence now indicates his erratic descent resulted from missile damage at a high altitude, and this theory is virtually completely dismissed today. Another more interesting theory is that the true purpose of Powers' mission was to be shot down, tossing a wrench into Soviet-American relations. Under this theory, Powers wasn't in on it at all, but elements within the American intelligence apparatus set him up. If this theory is accurate, the people behind the setup did so in order to stop American-Soviet relations from normalizing. While this idea is tempting and is definitely plausible, there's simply no evidence to support it, so it remains in the realm of speculation. Powers ended up working as a test pilot upon his return home and would eventually become an aircraft and helicopter pilot for a local news station in Los Angeles. Unfortunately, while Powers may have successfully survived one crash, in August 1977, his helicopter went down in Encino. Tragically, this crash resulted in the loss of his life, as well as that of his passenger. As far as I know, Powers is the only person to have 2 Wikipedia articles dedicated to plane crashes where he was the pilot. The sharp, explosive crack that rang through New York's Polo Grounds on August 16, 1920, didn't sound like a typical piece of baseball action. It didn't have the resonant wooden thwack of a bat connecting with a ball, nor the soft pop of a catcher's glove. Instead, it was a sound so violent and out of place that it reached Babe Ruth in right field, nearly 250 feet away from the action. In that split second, the trajectory of the sport changed forever. Ray Chapman, the star shortstop for the Cleveland Indians, didn't run toward first base. He didn't even turn his head. Chapman simply collapsed into the dirt, lifeless. This remains the only time in Major League Baseball history that a player's life was taken by an on-field injury. To truly grasp the weight of this moment, it's important to understand that the stakes for the 1920 season were higher than a cow grazing through a grow-op. As the middle of August rolled around, the American League was locked in a pennant race so tight, it felt like every pitch carried the weight of the world. 3 teams, the Cleveland Indians, the Chicago White Sox, and the New York Yankees, were all within a game of one another. Every single inning was played with a desperate, grinding intensity, and the atmosphere was made even more toxic by the swirling rumors of the Black Sox scandal. While the public didn't yet know all the details of the 1919 World Series fix, the whispers of corruption were everywhere. Fans and players alike were openly questioning the integrity of America's national pastime. The game on August 16th was the start of a critical series between Cleveland and New York. The Indians arrived at the Polo Grounds holding a tiny lead in the standings. It was a gray, miserable Monday afternoon. The sky was heavy with clouds, and a light rain had fallen throughout the early innings. This left the air thick with moisture and a settling fog that made visibility a constant battle for the hitters. In an era before stadium lights, the late afternoon shadows combined with the dreary weather to create a twilight effect that made tracking a small, moving object nearly impossible. Ray Chapman was the heart and soul of the Cleveland Club. At 29 years old, he was right in his prime. He was famously jovial, a storyteller who was loved by everyone from the rookies to the hardened veterans. He was even one of the rare people who stayed on friendly terms with the notoriously aggressive Ty Cobb. Off the field, Chapman's life was entering a new, promising chapter. He'd recently married Kathleen Daly, the daughter of a wealthy gas company executive. Because of his marriage and his desire to start a family, Chapman had already told teammates that 1920 would be his final year in professional baseball. He wanted to help Cleveland win its first pennant, and then retire to join his father-in-law's business. He was playing for his legacy. If Chapman was one of the league's most popular players, Carl Mays was arguably its most hated. Mays was a man who didn't seem to care for the social graces of the game. He was described as surly, unpleasant, and mean-spirited. Even his own teammates on the Yankees found him difficult to deal with, and his previous teammates on the Red Sox had actively disliked him. Mays was aware of his reputation and didn't seem to mind, once remarking that he'd long since stopped caring what most people thought about him. He was known as a dirty player who had no qualms with injuring a batter if he thought it would gain him and his team an advantage. May's pitching style was as abrasive as his personality. Mays used a submarine delivery, a motion where he'd contort his body so low that his knuckles would occasionally scrape the dirt on the mound. For a right-handed batter, the ball appeared to come from the ground, rising toward the hitter's waist, before darting and dipping in ways that were incredibly difficult to predict. This delivery was legal, but many players felt it was inherently dangerous because it was so hard to track, especially in poor lighting. It was also hard to fully control, and even good-natured pitchers who tossed one of these throws would routinely hit batters. But Mays was no good-natured pitcher, and he'd earned a reputation as a notorious headhunter. He'd led the league in hitting batters in 1917 and had no qualms about throwing high and tight to intimidate anyone who tried to crowd the plate. The danger of that afternoon was made even worse by the state of the equipment. In 1920, the balls weren't replaced nearly as often as they are today. A single baseball might stay in the game for several innings, regardless of how dirty it became. Pitchers were allowed to doctor the ball using various substances. They'd rub it with soil, licorice, or tobacco juice to make it darker and harder to see. They'd scuff it with sandpaper or their own fingernails to make it move erratically. When Mays faced Chapman, he was using a ball that witnesses described as being filthy and discolored. In the gloom of the polo grounds, a ball covered in tobacco juice and dirt, thrown from a low angle by a submariner, was effectively invisible against the background of the grandstand. Cleveland held a 3-run lead when Chapman led off the top of the 5th inning. As was his habit, he stood close to the plate, leaning in to gain an advantage for a possible bunt. Mays later claimed that Chapman was crowding the plate so much that he was nearly over the strike zone. Mays delivered a high inside fastball on a 1-1 count. Witnesses were haunted by Chapman's lack of reaction. He didn't duck or flinch. He didn't even turn his head. It's as if he never saw the ball leave Mays's hand, and given the visibility and the condition of the ball, it's likely he didn't. The ball struck Chapman squarely on the left temple. The sound of the impact was so similar to the sound of a bat hitting a ball that players thought the play was live. Mays watched the ball bounce back toward the mound, grabbed it, and threw it to first base. As the first baseman caught the ball, the stadium went silent. Chapman had crumpled to the ground, his knees buckling immediately. Blood began to flow from his left ear. The home plate umpire realized the severity of the situation and frantically called for a doctor from the stands. 2 physicians in attendance responded and rushed to the plate, where they found Chapman semi-conscious. In a testament to his grit, or perhaps a sign of the catastrophic brain trauma he'd just suffered, Chapman actually regained his feet a few minutes later. Assisted by his teammates, he began walking across the infield toward the clubhouse. He even managed to mumble a few words, reportedly telling his teammates he was fine, and asking them to tell Mays not to worry about him. However, as he reached second base, his body gave out. His legs buckled again, and he slipped into a deep unconsciousness. He had to be carried the rest of the way to the clubhouse, and was then rushed to St. Lawrence Hospital. When Chapman arrived at the hospital, the medical staff realized the injury was life-threatening. X-rays revealed a depressed fracture of the skull on the left side, roughly 3 inches long. But the damage wasn't just to the bone. The impact had been so powerful that his brain had been violently jarred inside his skull, causing lacerations on both sides of the organ. Surgeons decided that emergency surgery was the only option to relieve the intense pressure on his brain. The operation began just after midnight and lasted over an hour. They removed a piece of his skull to allow sufficient room for the swelling. Initially, there was a small amount of hope. His pulse stabilized, and his breathing seemed more regular for a few hours after the procedure. His manager reached out to Chapman's wife, Kathleen, who immediately boarded a train from Ohio to New York. But the hope was short-lived. Chapman's condition deteriorated rapidly in the pre-dawn hours. He passed away at 4:40 a.m. on August 17, 1920. His wife didn't arrive at the hospital until hours after he'd passed away, and when she was told the news, she collapsed in shock. And trust me, it would get so much worse for his widow from there on out. But I'll come back to that in a moment. The death of Chapman immediately turned Mays from a disliked player into a public pariah. The debate over whether the pitch was intentional began almost immediately. There are two distinct schools of thought. The first theory, championed by Mays's enemies, was that he intentionally hit Chapman. Ty Cobb was the most vocal proponent of this view, and argued that Mays' history and his mastery of the ball made it impossible for him to miss a target by that much unless it was purposeful. Those who disliked him believed he'd thrown at Chapman's head to clear him off the plate and assert dominance. While nobody thought his intention was to throw a fatal shot, the belief amongst this camp was that he had definitely sought to hurt Chapman. The fact that Mays never left the mound to check on Chapman while he was lying on the ground was cited as evidence of his cold-heartedness. The second theory is that the death was a tragic accident fueled by the environment of the game. Mays himself consistently argued that the ball was wet and discolored, and that the conditions in the ballpark weren't his fault. He pointed out that Chapman's habit of crowding the plate and leaning into pitches made him a difficult target to navigate. Even Chapman's manager eventually said that the Cleveland players didn't believe Mays hit him on purpose. Regardless of his intent, Mays was never the same in the eyes of the public. Players across the league took up a petition demanding he be banned from play permanently. While the league president eventually exonerated him, Mays remained a deeply controversial player for the rest of his career. He played until 1929 and was constantly greeted with boos and threats. Perhaps ironically, though, Mays enjoyed playing the role of the heel, since he had always been disliked anyway. While nothing could bring Ray Chapman back, his death forced Major League Baseball to modernize. The league realized that the safety of the players was being compromised by the focus on keeping balls in play, regardless of their condition. The first major change was the mandate for umpires to replace any ball that became dirty or scuffed. Secondly, the tragedy provided the final push needed to ban the use of unconventional pitches. While a handful of established pitchers were allowed to keep using the pitch until they retired, no new players were allowed to learn or use them. Curiously, the most obvious safety measure, the batting helmet, took much longer to become standard. While Chapman's death was used for decades as an argument for protective headgear, the tough guy culture of baseball resisted the change. It wasn't until the 1950s that helmets became common, and the league didn't make them mandatory for all players until 1971. Perhaps the saddest part of the story is what happened to the people Ray Chapman left behind. His death seemed to trigger a sequence of tragedies that wiped out his immediate family within a decade. His wife Kathleen never recovered from the grief. She gave birth to their daughter Ray in 1921, but the loss of her husband haunted her until she couldn't take the pain, ending it all in 1926. Sadly, their daughter died of the measles in 1929 at only 8 years old, having lost both her parents to the consequences of this perhaps intentional pitch. Nestled in southeastern Massachusetts lies a mysterious 200-square-mile region that has captivated paranormal enthusiasts for decades, the enigmatic Bridgewater Triangle. This area of alleged supernatural activity stretches across the towns of Abington, Rehoboth, and Freetown, with its influence often spilling into neighboring communities. The legend began taking shape when American cryptozoologist Loren Coleman coined the term Bridgewater Triangle, in his groundbreaking 1983 work, Mysterious America. Coleman's fascination with this particular region grew from an intriguing pattern he discovered while researching cryptid and paranormal encounters throughout New England. Time and again, unexplained incidents seemed to cluster within the same geographical boundaries, prompting him to map out what he considered a paranormal hot zone. While Coleman initially focused on cryptozoological creatures, later investigations would cast a much wider net, encompassing all manner of supernatural phenomena. At the heart of the triangle's mystique lies the foreboding Hockomock Swamp. The very name carries weight. In Algonquin, Hockomock translates to the place where spirits dwell. This reveals that this wetland held an otherworldly reputation long before Europeans arrived. This vast protected marshland sprawls across the landscape, its dense vegetation and rich wildlife creating an impenetrable wilderness. But according to numerous witnesses, the swamp harbors more than just natural inhabitants. Reports persist of ghostly orbs dancing through the mist and strange creatures lurking in the shadows. Whether these accounts stem from the area's isolated nature or something far more mysterious, Hockomock Swamp has become the beating heart of the Triangle's dark reputation. The region boasts another puzzling landmark, Dighton Rock, a massive 40-ton boulder resting in the Taunton River. This ancient stone canvas displays intricate petroglyphs that have baffled researchers for centuries. Theories about the mysterious carvings range from Portuguese explorers to Native American tribes, yet their true origin remains tantalizingly elusive. For believers in the Triangle's supernatural properties, Dighton Rock serves as yet another piece of the area's enduring puzzle. Local residents and curious visitors describe witnessing odd objects cutting through the night sky, spectral lights flickering between trees, and enormous birds soaring overhead. Others tell of haunting sounds echoing through the darkness, unexplained calls that seem to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. Perhaps most unsettling are the reports of massive black dogs that appear suddenly on roadways before vanishing without a trace. Also, just as an aside, why is it never creepy golden retrievers or something like that? I need a story that has sinister goldens. But I digress. Some theorists suggest these phantom canines might be skinwalker-like entities prowling the Triangle's boundaries. Even law enforcement officers have occasionally shared accounts of bizarre incidents within the region, though official explanations for these strange occurrences remain notably absent. Critics dismiss the Bridgewater Triangle as nothing more than fanciful legend building amplified by media attention. They contend that the area's ghost stories and creature sightings likely stem from misidentified animals, elaborate hoaxes, or folklore that has grown more elaborate with each telling. Nevertheless, the Triangle's enduring fascination may lie in its remarkable ability to ignite our collective imagination. New England's rich tradition of mysterious tales finds perfect expression in this region. I've said it before and I'll say it again. New England is by far the creepiest part of America, at least in terms of supernatural phenomena. This place where ancient forests and sprawling wetlands meet creates an ideal backdrop for encounters that defy easy explanation. Or perhaps it just provides the perfect background for a sighting of an owl at night, to be interpreted as something far more sinister. In pitch-black darkness beneath the Arctic waters, a young Russian naval officer scribbled a last message to his wife, tracing the words by touch on a piece of paper. He was one of 23 crew members who survived 2 devastating explosions aboard the nuclear submarine K-141 Kursk. But the worst was yet to come, and he and the other crew members found themselves trapped 300 feet below the surface with dwindling oxygen. This scenario unfolded in August 2000 when an enormous blast sent the pride of Russia's northern fleet to the bottom of the Barents Sea. The Kursk submarine disaster stands as one of the deadliest submarine incidents in modern history, claiming all 118 lives on board. Launched in 1994, this 450-foot behemoth was about as long as two jumbo jets and equipped with a double hull divided into 9 watertight compartments. Designed during the Soviet era to combat U.S. aircraft carrier groups, it carried 2 nuclear reactors and could fire 24 long-range cruise missiles and a mix of heavy torpedoes. At 24,000 tons of displacement, Kursk was the largest attack submarine in service, roughly 3 times the size of the biggest submarines in the U.S. Navy. It had recently been commended as having the best crew in Russia's northern fleet, and government officials called it, quote, virtually unsinkable. And seriously, I feel like describing a large ocean-going vessel as unsinkable should be permanently banned. In August 2000, Kursk joined the Russian Navy's first major naval exercise in over a decade. Morale was high as this mighty vessel prepared to demonstrate Russia's naval prowess. No one aboard or in the fleet imagined that the upcoming drill would turn into a nightmare. On the morning of August 12, 2000, Kursk was assigned to fire dummy torpedoes at a cruiser as part of the exercise. At 11:28 a.m. local time, as the crew loaded a large practice torpedo into one of the firing tubes, disaster struck without warning. A violent explosion rocked the submarine's forward compartments, equivalent to the blast of about 250 kilograms of TNT. Nearby vessels in the exercise felt the shock wave and heard a muffled boom, but before anyone could react, a second, far more powerful explosion erupted. This blast was massive, on the order of 3 to 7 tons of TNT, and registered as a 4.2 magnitude seismic event detectable as far away as Alaska. The double explosion blew the Kursk wide open and sent the submarine plummeting to the seafloor at a depth of about 350 feet. It came to rest roughly 50 miles off the Russian coast in the icy Barents Sea, a truly desolate hellscape. Inside the sub's first compartments, the force of the blasts instantly killed most of the crew and tore through bulkheads, collapsing the front of the vessel. Out of 118 personnel on board, only a couple dozen in the stern sections were left alive in the immediate aftermath. The exact cause of the initial explosion was later determined to be a leak of high-test peroxide, a volatile torpedo propellant. Investigators found that a faulty weld in the casing of a practice torpedo had allowed the highly concentrated hydrogen peroxide to seep out and react with metal. This in turn triggered a rapid expansion of gas and a fiery blast. This first explosion in turn ignited a fire in the torpedo room. Mere seconds later, as fire raged in the forward section, the heat caused up to 7 additional torpedo warheads to detonate in a catastrophic chain reaction. Kursk's 2 nuclear reactors luckily shut down automatically and avoided a nuclear meltdown. Within minutes, the unsinkable submarine lay crippled on the ocean floor. Shockingly, however, the rest of the fleet didn't immediately realize anything was wrong. Despite the explosions, Russian commanders initially failed to grasp that Kursk had suffered an accident. For reasons that remain unclear, the submarine's emergency systems, which should have signaled distress, had been disabled, potentially on purpose. Despite the loud explosions, it was only hours later, when Kursk missed a scheduled radio check-in, that alarm bells rang. What followed was a desperate but ill-fated rescue operation that unfolded over the next week. The Russian Navy, unprepared for such a disaster, scrambled its available rescue assets once it finally acknowledged that Kursk was missing. It took more than 16 hours after the blast for the Navy to even locate the submarine on the seabed. When rescue ships arrived at the scene, they found the vessel upright on the seafloor, but connecting to it proved incredibly difficult. Over the next 4 days, Russian teams made repeated attempts to dock diving bells and mini-submarines to Kursk's single rear escape hatch. Each attempt failed spectacularly, hampered by poor visibility, strong currents, extreme cold, and outdated equipment. Relations with Russia and the West were at an all-time high when this event occurred, and many countries surprisingly offered to help. However, in a move widely criticized later, Russian authorities initially refused all foreign assistance, saying no to all outside help. Whether due to pride, secrecy concerns, or false optimism, this delay proved fatal. For 5 days, as Russian rescuers floundered, offers from Britain, Norway, and others were rebuffed. Only on the 5th day of the crisis did President Vladimir Putin authorize acceptance of British and Norwegian help. However, by then, precious time had been lost. Disturbingly, by the time British and Norwegian rescue teams arrived on August 20th, they only found a silent compartment where the survivors had been. In the end, all 118 sailors on Kursk were lost, making it one of the worst naval disasters in Russian history. Though most of Kursk's crew died instantly, a group of 23 sailors in the rear compartments survived the initial explosions and lived for several hours hoping for rescue. As the forward sections flooded and went dark, these men, including Captain Dmitry Kolesnikov, moved toward the 9th compartment at the very back of the submarine. They found temporary refuge there, sealing themselves off from rising water. In a note later recovered from Kolesnikov's body, he described how the survivors had gathered in compartment 9 and tried to use the escape hatch. 2 or 3 crewmen apparently attempted to don escape suits and ascend through the hatch, but their plan failed. It's believed that the hatch might have been damaged, or that the men were thwarted by injuries and the flooding waters. And seriously, it's hard to imagine the absolute terror that must have taken hold at that time. In that frigid, pitch-dark compartment, the surviving sailors faced dwindling oxygen and extreme peril. The final moments for these survivors was perhaps the most horrifying fate of all. An analysis later suggested that as oxygen ran low after several hours, the men tried to activate a chemical oxygen generator to extend their air supply. This was a last-ditch effort to survive just a little bit longer. They knew what they were about to do was dangerous. The men had no choice, though. In the wet, oily environment, the generator likely reacted violently with seawater and caused a flash fire or explosion, consuming the remaining oxygen. The final moments would have been terrifying. A sudden fireball in the confined space, then asphyxiation of any who still remained. In the wake of the disaster, Russia faced the challenge of recovering the Kursk and determining what went wrong. Under intense public pressure, Putin agreed to raise the wreck from the seabed for investigation, despite the technical hurdles. An international salvage team led by a Dutch company was contracted at a cost of roughly $100 million to lift the giant submarine. In October 2001, after months of preparation, engineers used a complex array of cables and cranes to hoist the Kursk out of the mud and transport it to a dry dock. Due to safety concerns, they had to cut off the front section, the site of the torpedo explosions, and leave it on the sea floor. This meant some physical evidence of the very cause of the accident was lost, fueling ongoing speculation as to the true cause of the Kursk disaster.